All right, we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on employment services. Firstly, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are all on today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Sally Sinclair. Sally is the CEO of the National Employment Services Association, the peak body for the Australian employment services sector. Sally has been instrumental in informing key stakeholders, both domestically and internationally, on addressing employment and inclusion challenges, including strengthening the integration of employment, education and training, and increasing employment of disadvantaged job seekers, including Indigenous job seekers, people with disability, migrants and refugees, long-term unemployed, youth and mature age. Sally has over 3 decades of domestic and international expertise in the design and development and delivery of employment services. Her experience spans the non-for-profit and for-profit sectors, as well as numerous government appointments and industry expert groups. Among her expert roles, Sally is a member of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Market Oversight Advisory Group, the Employment Services Trial Reference Group, the DES Reference Group, the VET Stakeholder Committee, and the Minister's Disability Employment Advocacy Council. Sally was a member of the Australian Government's Welfare Reform Reference Group, the G20 Civil Society 20, C20 Steering Committee, the Minister's Employment Services 2020 Expert Advisory Panel, and 5 working groups within that. Sally has, and the Minister's National Disability and Carers Advisory Council. Sally chaired the C20 Inclusive Growth and Employment Working Group and the NDCAC Employment Reform Working Group. Sally is a board of the OECD Local Development Forum and is an expert advisor to the OECD Employment and Skills Strategy in Southeast Asia Initiative. Sally is also a board member of the International Council for Career Development and Public Policy. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sally. Before I ask Sally to get started, we would just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the Q&A box, and we will be able to ask a couple of questions at the end of the presentation today. So Sally, I'd now like to ask you to start your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam, and thank you so much for the invitation to talk with you and with your members. It's a very different world to one we've ever experienced before. So for me, I'm in Melbourne and I'm still in my home and I'm still kind of navigating the COVID challenges that everybody's been navigating. But notwithstanding that, it's remained an incredibly busy and challenging period for everyone. So before I actually start my presentation, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting on today, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today. Sam, I might, because you're driving the presentation for me, I might get you to start for me, if that's okay.
Can we see that? Is that
yes? Yes. Okay. So if that's the first slide. So if we go to the next slide, Sam.
No problem.
About us, we are as Sam said, the national peak body for the Australian employment services sector. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we were established in 1997 in preparation for the commencement of contracted public employment services in 1998. So what was originally known as the Job Network and is currently known as Job Active and all of the related complementary programs. I was actually the inaugural chair of NESA, in 1997, and then after a short sabbatical rejoined them and have been the CEO for quite some time now, since 2001. So we've got a very diverse membership. We've got, we were structured and set up to cover the whole sector. So our members are for-profit, not-for-profit, and also some public institutions, some TAFEs, for example, who are delivering public employment services under contract to government and various labour market assistance arrangements. So our members' collective footprint covers 100% of the employment service regions across Australia. So very, very wide and very deep is our membership and our representation. The one thing I might just comment on too is that we're not funded by government. So we are genuinely a member funded and driven organisation. So thanks, Sam. We might go to the next slide. So our areas of particular focus, given who we are and what we were kind of set up to do, and our mission is to really focus on sort of policy and research that advances improvements in employment services delivery for job seekers and for employers. And we do that once completed, we do that via our representation and advocacy, obviously with particular focus on the federal government, given the way in which a lot of the funding arrangements are structured, but it also includes other jurisdictions, state governments, even local governments, and also key stakeholders across the sector, particularly employer representatives and social services representatives. And again, informing our kind of continuous loop of improvement, we engage in a lot of capacity building and innovation across the employment services space, where we're working with our members to continuously improve their capability for delivery. That includes professionalisation of the workforce. It includes kind of the delivery of professional development across the workforce, but also building capacity. For example, we're working right across remote Australia in doing a lot of community development work that supports the work of providers. So we don't go in and do the direct delivery ourselves, but everything we do is about building capacity for our members. Okay. So I thought I'd give you just a little bit of an overview of Australian employment services. So we are unique in the OECD in that we're the only country that has a fully outsourced public employment service. Some other countries are partially outsourced and others are on the journey of fully contracting out, but Australia is quite unique and therefore gets a lot of attention for its model. So this diagram represents a fully outsourced market, for want of a better expression. The programs are typically national, like Job Active or Disability Employment Services, but the contracts are agreed at a local level, and that therefore is designed to try and ensure that there's a localised approach to solutions for employers and job seekers. It's a very competitive commissioning process, and there have been kind of different procurement processes over that period of the last 20 years, and we'll talk towards the end of the presentation about the current directions for government moving more to a licensing type of model than requests for tenders, which is typically what has been their procurement approach in the past. But certainly the characteristics of the programs are that the funding is outcome based, and outcomes are really defined by sustainable employment, be that kind of 12, 26 weeks or even 52 weeks as it is in disability employment services. There's a comparative performance framework, and again, slightly different for different programs, but the one that's best known is obviously the star ratings model, in job active and disability employment services, which actually compares providers right across the footprint of Australia. And there's also a quality framework, which actually informs and assures the quality of service delivery, and there are various benchmarks in the contracts. I should say that typically the deed, for example, for job active is over 300 pages, and there's over 1,500 pages of guidelines. So whilst there's often a lot of criticism of the services, they're very highly regulated. And there is consequently a lot of red tape, but nevertheless very little kind of margin for error in terms of providers' delivery of the services that are being contracted and required by government. So we might go to the next slide. So the Australian employment services model has really been characterised quite strongly by what the OECD describes as an activation model. And this has been kind of very much part of the framework since 2003. The first two contracts were a bit more reflective of the earlier arrangements of labour market programs, perhaps a bit more kind of engagement oriented, but activation was introduced in 2003 as part of the active participation model, and that's really become the kind of centrepiece of how the Australian government chooses to ensure that kind of mutual obligation between the job seeker and the state is managed, and certainly therefore people are required to participate in exchange for their income support. And there's a whole lot of mechanisms, as we know, that go to how people travel through the system. It's a very strong compliance model. I'm not sure that necessarily when the OECD started out with the concept of activation that it was intended to be so compliance centred. I think the idea was activation is meant to actually correlate with engagement, but how do you do that and how you get that positive engagement when you've got a whole lot of rules and regulations is quite an interesting tension in the system for providers and for frontline workers as well as the job seekers. But to give you some idea of the metrics, there's over 1.5 million job seekers now in the system, kind of as a consequence of COVID. Roughly 1 million of those are actually in some kind of face-to-face service. The rest are in the government's newly fast-tracked online employment service. There's nearly 6,000 program sites across Australia. We've got a workforce of over 25,000 people, and there's over 250 providers. And as I said, that's a mix of providers across the footprint. Thanks, Sam. So again, a little bit of a schematic. In a simplified world, people interact with Centrelink, they make a claim for their income support, and then they go through the employment services gateway. Now, last night's budget announcement indicated that that gateway is going to have some additional investment, and essentially, because it's all online now, the individual, when they go into the online employment service, they must complete their job seeker snapshot in order to be eligible for their income support. So that's a new measure that's just been introduced last night, and that will mean that people will have completed that snapshot, which is designed to then provide flags as to whether people need personalised supports or whether they can stay in the online employment service, and that will provide them with the assistance that they need. We've got the major programs listed there. They're all, the three major programs are administered by different federal departments, so that does become a little bit confusing. Obviously, the Department of Education, Skills and Employment administered Job Active, Department of Social Services administered Disability Employment Services, and the National Indigenous Australians Agency administered the Community Development Program, which is the employment program for all of remote Australia. Disability Employment Services and Job Active cover the same kind of footprint in non-remote Australia, but Disability Employment Services is for people where their disability is their major barrier to employment and is classified as a moderate to severe disability. It doesn't have as many job seekers in it as what Job Active does. It has about 250, maybe nearly 300,000 now, compared to the Job Active caseload of about 1 million. But its cost is similar. Because it's a much more intensive service. And then there's a whole lot of complementary programs that you will have heard, and there were a lot of different announcements in last night's budget about additional funding for some of those services, such as Time to Work, Parents Next, Transition to Work. And then it's a really question of how individuals get connected in with those complementary programs, particularly through their engagement with Job Active. Thanks, Sam. I thought it might be interesting just to note the journey that we've been on in terms of how this has all come about. And as you'll see, we had for a long time the CES, the Commonwealth Employment Service. So if there's anybody kind of on the line who remembers the CES, I mean, I remember actually going to the CES when I was a recent graduate, interestingly enough, in one of our earlier recessions in the early 80s, and registered with the Professional Employment Service, which was the professional arm of the CES. But back in those days, you just registered and you took the, all the jobs were listed on a board. And there wasn't really, there's a very romantic view of what the CES might have been, but my experience is I'm still waiting to hear back from the CES for the application that I made all those years ago. And really during the 90s, when we had the massive crisis of the recession of the early 90s, and unemployment, reached over 11.5%, and youth unemployment was 25%. The then Keating government said, look, we've clearly got a major problem. We've got to find another solution. So they started to trial the outsourcing of contracted case management of people who were long-term unemployed, and they engaged a range of different non-government organisations from both the for-profit and not-for-profit sectors. So that was the genesis of everything. And then there was a change of government. The Howard government was elected in 1996, and they kind of looked at the fact that at that time the CES had become very bureaucratic, and really there was lots of processing of people, but they weren't actually getting jobs. And they certainly were people who were disadvantaged were not really getting any traction. But they were noted that this contracted case management model was actually getting really good results. So there was a big white paper, and the outcomes of that was that the government sort of took that model and decided to extrapolate that out and contract out the work of the Public Employment Service and create the job network. And then, of course, we've had the last 20 years where we've had lots of different program iterations and changes. The main ones being the reform of the job network in 2009 to become Job Services Australia. And at that stage, the then Rudd government integrated 7 programs into one to create a kind of a bigger mainstream model. We then had another change of government in 2013, and the consequence of that was to create the Job Active model, which was a much sort of more employer demand driven kind of approach with strengthened outcome performance payments. Fine for a very buoyant economy and a strong labour market. Lots of challenges in the middle of a pandemic. Notwithstanding that, the government, sort of as it was considering what to do, originally this contract would have been due for kind of implementation of the next contract iteration in July of this year. So it was meant to be a 5-year contract with the new contract to come into place in July 2020. But in 2018, the government kind of embarked on a process of saying, well, look, is it doing what we want it to do? And at the same time, we've got this kind of digital transformation that's happening right across government. And we know that there are countries around the world that are quite effectively utilising digital platforms. Maybe we should be looking at all of that and looking at how we might prepare for the next iteration of employment services. And because by the time, so having been on the expert panel, by the time we concluded our work and we had our report to government, we were then kind of coming up to another election. And so the government then said we will extend the contracts for 2 years if re-elected, and we will put in place a whole lot of trials of what's being proposed through the I Want to Work model. So the outcome was that government did get re-elected. The contracts were extended for 2 years, so the current job active contracts expire in mid-2022. And in the process, the government started in 2 regions in Australia, in mid-north coast of New South Wales and in South Adelaide, started to trial the concept of a new employment services model. And that model is sort of characterised by digital first, digital plus and enhanced services, which I'll go into in a minute. But of course, what's actually happened is the government, with the impact of COVID, decided it would fast track the online employment service. So it has now brought that forward, and it's actually rolled that out effectively from July this year. So about half of the people that became unemployed during the pandemic have been referred into employment services, and the other half have remained in the online employment service. So we're in a kind of an interesting space at the moment in terms of what that's going to look like for job seekers, depending upon what part of the system they're in. Okay, so we might go to the next slide. So as I say, the idea when the panel developed the I Want to Work report, which is on the DESI website, so if you haven't, perhaps you should access it and have a read and see what the intentions are behind the proposed report, was that you would have these trials, as I've mentioned, that the government would obviously embark on this massive digital transformation process. And the idea is that there would be much greater interconnectivity between various government platforms, including Centrelink and the tax office, utilising a lot of the existing tools they've got, but enhancing them and building them and developing them. But that would be done utilising kind of principles of co-design with providers, with government departments, with job seekers and employers, which indeed the development of the report did. Maybe not so much since we've seen some of these rapid implementations, but that's been quite challenging just because of the sheer impacts of the pandemic and the challenges of how you do all of that when you're doing that kind of consultation, that interaction virtually. Okay. And the other thing I think which is very important for you in particular is looking at the localised approach and local solutions to local problems. So this is an area that I've had a very strong interest in for a long time, particularly through my involvement with the OECD, where I've been on the board for the Local Development Forum for over 10 years. And this is something that we've been long advocating for for government to kind of strengthen the localised approach. So the contracting arrangements can provide a localised approach, but you need more than that. You need local stakeholder engagement. And I note that obviously, so this is an area we've been advocating for in terms of innovation, and obviously the government has made its announcements, and then in last night's budget looked at the funding envelope for rolling out its kind of framework for local jobs approaches with local jobs boards and employment facilitators in a number of regions across Australia that are identified as having high needs. So this is something that I think will be a very interesting area to look at how that works. Obviously, it'll be thoroughly evaluated, and it's an area where, as service providers, it's very important, I think, for if you're in those areas to actually get engaged with the new local jobs boards and the employment facilitators. Okay. We go, so on to the next one. Okay, so the reason, I think the things we all want to hear about, the future of Australian employment services. So the next slide, Sam. So as I mentioned, we've got the trials underway. And the idea was that new elements would be introduced iteratively throughout the trial, and that the models themselves would be kind of finalised by next May's budget, because procurement of employment services is generally a 12-month timeline. By the time government sets aside its forward estimates in the budget, then comes out with its request for tender or request for proposal, as they'll do with a licensing model, the time it takes to assess them all, make the offers, and then make the transition. It takes 12 months. So the idea with the model is, of course, that we've got this digital first, the online employment service, which has now been fast-tracked, but it's an online service with support from a national customer service centre. It's designed really for people who are job ready, who are digitally literate, and who can self-manage online. So I have to say, we've gone out today into the press to say we've got some concerns about some of the assumptions that the government's made about how many people it thinks can be serviced through this service, as distinct from, providing personalised or face-to-face services. Digital Plus is a concept which came through the work of the panel, and I'd have to say particularly myself, based on experience, and that is that, some people need a little bit more. They may not need the full enhanced service, but they need to kind of understand how they've got to have support in terms of how they engage in activities. They may be able to self-manage to a great degree, but occasionally they're going to need some sort of personalised supports just to navigate their way through the system. Maybe they need access to tickets or licences, such as a forklift licence, for example. So that service is being trialled through the government's contact centre arrangements. And then the enhanced services are those that are provided by providers, and they are for the most disadvantaged. Now, that was pre-COVID. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people that may not make their way back into the workforce all that easily over the next 12 months, and it could well be that a lot of those folk will then end up in enhanced services, because the government's come out and said that it's looking at a 12-month maximum time on the digital service, at which point it will transfer people to enhanced services. So it's really a question of how we go over the next 12 months and how big, unfortunately, potentially our long-term unemployment issue is as a consequence of the impacts of the pandemic. But obviously the idea with the enhanced service is that actually they can provide a whole wraparound service. And one of the areas that are being trialled with the model is a different payment model. So payment for milestones rather than just on hard employment outcomes, and also a performance model, which is perhaps a bit more of a benchmarking type of approach rather than the kind of star ratings model that uses all of this regression analysis, but isn't necessarily kind of, it's comparative, but it's not aspirational as such. Okay, thanks, Sam. So the licensing, so the government has sort of decided that it's going to move to more of a licensing model, and that is away from its typical approach in the past 20 years has been procurement through a request for tender, which are quite blunt processes, you know, particularly if it's a new model like this is. There are government rules which say you can't roll the services over when there's such a material change. So they've got to go through a whole 100% turnover of the market. Now they'll need to do that anyway with creating this new market, but providing there's then not whole scale policy and program changes going forward, they can then just refresh and renew licenses going forward. And in fact, licensing was actually recommended by the Productivity Commission in 2002 when they did a review of the job network. So it's not a new thing. It's just taking a fair amount of time to kind of work its way through the system. It will still be a kind of a managed market. I mean, because it's not really a market. You have a finite number of job seekers that everyone's obviously working with. It's not as if it's everybody in Australia who's looking for a job. And but the idea is to make it a bit more contestable and to give providers of maybe specialist services, for example, the opportunity to actually enter the market so that the barriers are not as high for entry to the market, but then again, they're not as high for exit either. So there's, as you can see, there's a number of design principles, and I mean, these are yet to really be kind of mapped out and worked through, but the discussion paper obviously poses a number of questions for organisations and their representative bodies to consider. Okay, next one. Thank you. So yes, so the key elements, as we know from the paper, there's a panel, a national panel, but then there's sub-panels proposed for each employment region. As I've said, a managed market for providers. Duration of all new licenses are proposed to be for 3 years. We think it needs to be a little bit longer to enable for a little bit more stability. And we can have also potentially specialist providers, for example, providers who are providing specialist services to clients who are culturally and linguistically diverse. And also they're looking at industry specialists like workforce specialists so that they can bring in, for example, kind of regional approaches where there may be big infrastructure projects, or sectoral approaches where there's high demand, such as in the provision of care. So it's going to look really quite different, I think, going forward, and it will be, I think, quite a diverse group and range of providers, and probably a little bit more like the job network looked like in 1998 when we had over 300 providers. Okay, thanks, Sam. So yes, so high performers rewarded with license extensions, as they've outlined in the paper. There'll be regular performance data releases. One thing Desi's very good at is data, and there's a lot of it. So, and they've got kind of very strong capability in data management and analysis. Obviously, once you're in, it's a much more streamlined procurement process. So, you know, not having to go through this continual process of tendering for provision of services, and hopefully the outcome of that is that it will result in less red tape, and there will certainly be strong attempts to reduce the admin burden and to simplify the deed and and the guidelines. Okay. So the impacts of COVID, look, as I've mentioned, we've now got, well, that says 1.4 million. I think we've actually up to 1.6 million job seekers in the system. Maybe not everyone is on the job active caseload as such. So when pre the pandemic, that was 640,000 people. So that's been a massive shock and adjustment to everyone who's interact with the system. So as I've mentioned, there's been the fast tracking of the introduction of the online employment service. There's been the suspension of mutual obligations up until the end of September, recently reintroduced. So that's meant that there's been a decreased level of job seeker engagement. Only folk have been able to volunteer, but a lot of people have just been reluctant to do that during the pandemic. That from a provider's point of view has had kind of big impacts on their financial viability, given the way the model is actually constructed, being paid for performance, and obviously on size of caseloads. So we've been working that through with government, and there have been some adjustments that have been made during this period as far as the way in which the payment arrangements are calibrated. And it's also had implications for provider performance as well. So I think that gets us there to questions. And so I'm happy, Sam, to take any questions from the floor.
I'll just unmute myself.
No worries.
And get out of the presentation. There we go. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sally. I think that provides a fantastic overview of, you know, where the employment services model is currently and also what the future is. And I suppose now is an extremely timely
very
time for us to be having this webinar and having this conversation with the discussion paper out and with people having these conversations about what that actually will look like and how we can have a say in what that looks like. So thank you so much for that. We'll go to some questions. Okay, so we've got one question here. So it says, how does the new employment services trial aim to eradicate the unequal access to digital platforms?
It's a very big question. I am concerned about how this is all going to work. And I would have, personally, I would have preferred if we could have kept the digital service in the trial and made sure like it was fit for purpose and ready to go in July 2022, which was how it was designed. When the pandemic hit, the government just couldn't deal with the sheer volume of people. So they had the online employment service, and so they put people in there whilst they sorted out getting them referred to providers. But kind of in the process, obviously, the decision was made by government, and unfortunately there wasn't any consultation about it to then fast track this digital employment service. So a lot of it is being built as they're going. It's not as it would have been if it had been completely trialled, where all the elements would have been developed iteratively and we would have had a model which was kind of really fit for purpose. So I am a bit concerned about what that will mean, because people, it's going to be an opt-out system. It's not an opt-in. So you've got to be able to get out. And the government's assurances are that you can do that. But our anecdotal feedback already is people find it very hard to opt out. And so if you have people in there whose English is not their first language, for example, they may not know, like they don't necessarily know how to navigate their way through. And if it's hard for them to get out or to disengage, and they're not familiar with the system, that's exactly the type of group we're really concerned about. So I think that this is where, if they're connected
Mm.
to other services, that those services will need to become their advocates to make sure that they can actually then get into personalised supports, because otherwise there's a good chance that they'll just sit there and they'll stay there for 12 months not really knowing how to navigate their way. I think there'll be lots of great products that are on there, and it'll be very kind of, it'll be very high tech, but it's not the same as actually having a personal interaction with an employment coach.
Absolutely, absolutely. And related to that question is there language support available on the online platform that they're proposing?
Look, this is a very interesting question. It is meant to be available, as I understand it, in multiple languages. But again, I'm not clear on how all of that's going to work, because it's all being done by government, and it doesn't actually really have any kind of user input or stakeholder engagement. We've been saying you need to have a kind of a user-centered design approach with this, and particularly with job seekers, so that any of these issues can be kind of worked through. Again, had that been done through a trialling process, I think on a smaller scale, I think that would result in a better quality experience for people then transitioning in mid-2022. But now it's kind of going to be more a case of what fixes do we have to kind of plug in as we go. So again, I would say the more feedback you have that you can kind of filter through, and we're happy to take that feedback, if that's kind of the way it works, is because we want to make sure that people are getting the right supports.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Sally. Next question is, thank you, Sally. How do you see resolving tension between compliance and activation, as you mentioned?
Yeah, look, they're great questions, I've got to say. It is really challenging. So we do a lot of capacity building and capability development with our members, and with their workforce, around engagement and positive interactions and discussions, and how to, a coaching process in terms of how to move people along the path to employment. And it is a tension, because and often you'll see in the press that it's the employment services providers that get criticised for being punitive or mean, or whatever it is, or the worker themselves. But they're trying their best to have that engagement approach, but they've got the government's legislation and regulations saying, if this person doesn't turn up, you've got basically no control with the targeted compliance framework. No show, it gets automatically reported to Centrelink. So in the past, they used to have discretion. They used to be able to, they used to have a thing called a participation report. And if someone didn't turn up, then they didn't have to mark them as absent like they do now. If they knew that someone had something going on in their life, or maybe they didn't understand the instructions, then they wouldn't put the participation report in now. But now they actually have no control over that now. It's hard-coded into the system. So this is also a real challenge, because it's the providers that are often kind of blamed for that when they're trying to have an engagement approach with people, but the legislation's driving the behaviours a certain way. I think the only way you can change that is to change the legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we've got a whole lot of questions coming in. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to go through all of them, so apologies if we miss out on your question. Just got one here in the chat box sent to us, Sally. Is there any training for job active workers to know how to deal with refugees who experience trauma?
We run a lot of, that is a very good question. We actually do run a lot of professional development, more broadly around people who have mental health conditions, who may have experienced torture or trauma, and providing strategies for that. I wouldn't say that it's specifically targeted at refugee groups, but there's certainly a lot of functional development work. And then we know, obviously, we've got members that are quite, well, they have their own expertise in those areas, and we've got a couple of members who are obviously also settlement services providers as well. So they've got particular capability. But I might take that out. I might take that offline and talk to our PD people about whether there's something quite specific and quite targeted that we could look at there.
That would be wonderful. Thanks, Sally. Next question is, thanks, Sally. They put thanks, Sally. Will niche community-based organisations be able to apply for a licence relating to their particular cohort?
Yeah, I think this is where it's actually, I think this is where it's very exciting. And I think that's why we will see more providers, and we might see more smaller providers in the system that are very locally connected, and certainly where you've got specialist capability or kind of working with particular cohorts, there'll definitely be opportunities. The only caveat I would say is one of the challenges that we've always had with specialist providers over the 20 years is having enough caseload to make the service viable. So you just need to be mindful of that and think about how it integrates with the other things that you do in terms of your planning and your preparation.
Absolutely. Thank you. Which question? There's so many great questions here. Coming back to, I think, the current model, what level of advocacy can we as workers assist our multicultural clients with?
Well, I think this question of the digital employment service is a biggie. I think that the extent to which clients who might be in that service are supported with relevant materials in their own language is very important. I think also you can, for those individuals who may be eligible for connection with providers, there's a real opportunity to kind of, in terms of how you develop those working relationships with the provider organisations both at your local level, but sometimes maybe if you're not getting the cut through locally with the head offices of the relevant providers. So I think there's a range of different areas that that you can be working with, because, you know, and again, for something like the targeted compliance framework, which is a government legislation, that's probably something for the Migration Council, quite frankly, to be taking up if people are inadvertently finding that they're not complying because they don't fully understand. I think that's an important thing as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm mindful of the time, and you do have another meeting to run to. So
yes, I'll give you 5 more minutes and then I have to opt out.
No, thanks, Sally. We'll just ask a couple more questions if that's okay.
Sure.
So one question related to that we've had sent through the chat box is, where should we go to provide feedback or a complaint on Job Active services?
Well, there's a couple of mechanisms. There's actually a national customer service line, which is managed by the department. Now, they provide assurances that it has Chinese walls so that it will be able, because the government's now a provider with its online employment service. So they've assured us that that national customer service line will be able to take complaints and manage them independently, which will relate to both the provider network and also the online employment service. The providers themselves must, under their contractual arrangements, have clear customer service complaints processes, and they're all audited as part of the quality assurance process that is actually managed by the department. So you can also should have complaints with, you know, if it's about a particular individual as distinct from the organisation, then also you lodge the complaint with the provider, or you may want to do that first, and then depending upon your response, then go to the National Customer Service line. I mean, my view is that complaints are actually a good thing, that it actually helps organisations to improve their service delivery. If I had a complaint about me, I'd rather know.
Yeah.
And know what I need to do, or what I need to kind of improve in terms of the customer service experience.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one last question that we've received is, challenges in supporting migrants and refugees has been a massive issue for employment services for many years. Do you believe the new employment services model proposed by the Australian government will address these issues?
I think that it will go some way.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, until the government improves its investment in employment services, we'll never get to quite the benchmark that we need. But I think being able to bring in specialist expertise will assist as part of that process, and will certainly be there at front and centre in terms of how we lead the sector in relation to the professionalisation of the sector. So the more capability development, so we've got a professional recognition framework that we've developed. We've got a digital credentialing framework that we're rolling out. So there's be a whole range of things that I think will be able to support better service delivery. But I have to say, you know, at the end of the day, we're the current investment in employment services Australia is half of the OECD average. So until the government gets us up to the OECD average, it's going to be hard to have the quality of services that we would all like to have everywhere. And, you know, that's an unfortunate, and today, rather than doing that, we've had $1.4 billion taken out of the services over the next 4 years. So aspirationally, if I was in charge and writing the checks, then, you know, we'd have enough money in the system for it to meet everyone's expectations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Sally. So I'm mindful we've got 1 more minute.
Okay.
Oh, do you have anything else to say? Sorry, Sally.
No, I was going to say, if you want to send me through any questions, and happy to kind of get back.
That would be great, because we have received quite a lot in the chat box, via email, and also the Q&A box. So I might send you a list of questions if that's all right.
Yeah, great. Not a problem.
Thank you for that. And yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation today, and just really being able to, I guess, holistically show what the employment landscape is looking like now, but also into the future, and I guess the areas of advocacy that we need to be you know, pushing for and having conversations about. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Really a great pleasure. And I mean, I'm a great admirer of the work of your members, and you know, I've kind of been on this, like back in the day, we used to have you know, the migrant resource centres delivering services at the start of Job Network, and they were all my members then. And we used to have special interest groups for CAL job seekers, and you know, things have sort of changed, and there's been a lot more kind of this normalisation in the services, and I think it'll be great to bring some of that back in. So look forward to the engagement going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you everyone for participating today. Just a reminder that SETSCoP, we're doing a submission for the discussion paper as well. So if you have any feedback or suggestions that you'd like to add into that, please just email us. And yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you, Sally. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.